For months my coworker dumped all his work on me, then stole my credit and bonuses. But I built a secret plan that destroyed his career overnight. My coworker stole credit for my work for months, but when I exposed him, his entire career crumbled. That's how it all started. You see, every office has that one person. The smooth talker. The one who looks like they're working hard, but in reality, they're just shoving their responsibilities onto someone else. And unfortunately, in my office, that person was Mark. Mark was the kind of guy who wore expensive suits and flashy watches, always smiling at the bosses like he was their best friend. He'd crack jokes during meetings, make it seem like he had everything under control, and somehow, he always ended up being the one praised when the quarterly reports came out. But here's the catch. Almost all of his amazing work wasn't his. It was mine. At first, I thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I just wasn't speaking up enough. Maybe I should have been more assertive in meetings. But the truth revealed itself quickly. I would spend late nights perfecting financial analyses, writing reports, and creating presentations. The next day, Mark would walk into the boardroom, my slides in his hand, my numbers on the screen, and he'd present them like he had burned the midnight oil. The bosses would clap. They'd nod approvingly. And then, he'd get a bonus. And me. Just a pat on the back. Now, I'm not the kind of person who enjoys conflict. I always believed in keeping my head down, doing my work, and letting results speak for themselves. But in this case, my results were being stolen. And no matter how much I tried to drop hints, "Oh yeah, I stayed up late working on those figures," or "I really struggled with that slide deck last night," Mark would swoop in, laugh it off, and twist the story. He'd say things like, "Oh yeah, we worked on that together." Or worse, "Yeah, I had to fix a lot of mistakes before sending it in." And my bosses believed him. That's when the anger started building inside me. It wasn't just frustration, it was humiliation. I felt invisible, like my hard work meant nothing unless it came out of Mark's mouth. He was making more money, getting recognition, climbing the corporate ladder. All because I was doing his job. And the worst part? He knew exactly what he was doing. One Friday afternoon, when most people had left early, I was still at my desk, fixing errors in the department's monthly budget report. Mark strolled by, whistling, and dropped a stack of half-finished spreadsheets on my desk. "Be a champ and polish this up for me, will you? Boss wants it by Monday." Then he winked, patted my shoulder like I was his assistant, and left. That was the breaking point. Something snapped in me that day. I wasn't just annoyed anymore. I was furious. I realized that as long as I stayed quiet, Mark would keep milking me like his personal workhorse. And the higher he climbed, the more invisible I'd become. So I decided, if he was going to play dirty, I'd outplay him. But I wasn't going to confront him. Oh no. That would have been pointless. Mark was too good at twisting stories, too smooth at talking his way out of things. If I tried to tell the boss, Mark would just smile, laugh, and somehow make me look like the problem. No, I needed undeniable proof. Something so solid, so detailed, that even Mark's silver tongue couldn't wriggle out of it. That's when the idea hit me. I would document everything. Every project. Every report. Every late night. Every spreadsheet. I would keep a secret journal, a record of who actually did the work. And once I had enough evidence, I'd pull the rug from under Mark so fast that his whole fake empire would collapse. But here's the thing about revenge. It requires patience. You can't rush it. You can't get sloppy. You have to wait for the perfect moment. And I was ready to wait. Because this wasn't just about a stolen report or a lost bonus. This was about justice. And when justice finally came for Mark, it was going to hit him harder than he ever imagined. To be continued. The plan began as a whisper in the back of my mind, a slow-burning strategy that needed patience, precision, and a cold, almost clinical distance. If Mark was the artist of appearances, I would become the archivist of truth. For weeks I became a ghost in the office. Present but unseen, listening, logging, collecting. I transformed my notebook into something sacred, a ledger of small betrayals, a careful catalog of who typed what, who emailed what, who claimed credit for whose hours. It wasn't melodramatic or vengeful at first. It was methodical. Every item had to be verifiable. Every claim had to survive the scrutiny of a skeptical manager. I taught myself to treat feelings as evidence only when they could be translated into timestamps, drafts, and witness notes. I learned to read the rhythms of the workplace. There were patterns. Mark always arrived late on Fridays, smiling from the doorway as if he had conquered the week. He had a habit of forwarding my emails with a casual, FYI, and then, in meetings, he would speak as though those forwarded notes had been his own initiative. He cultivated allies, a junior analyst who fancied himself Mark's protege, and an HR coordinator who loved the way Mark told stories about his sacrifice for the team. I watched them, not to gloat but to map the social geometry that kept his lies afloat. I studied who asked about metrics and who asked about personalities, who trusted a confident tone and who preferred receipts. My notes grew into dossiers. I printed versions of spreadsheets with tracked changes showing the gradual evolution of my work. I saved drafts with timestamps, saved emails and rewrites, and compiled screenshots showing my name attached to versions that were later presented as Mark's final masterpiece. I even began to annotate the margins with quiet observations. Mark forwarded on March 12th with no changes, marked as urgent by Mark, deadline met by me, performance praise on April 1st credited to Mark. The muscle memory of documentation became a comfort. Each saved file was a tiny talisman against the erasure I had been suffering. I kept backups, encrypted copies, and a separate offline ledger that no one could tamper with. But documentation alone would not be enough. Evidence had to be presented so that it couldn't be dismissed as sour grapes. So I refined my approach into 3 surgical moves: verification, exposure, and orchestration. Verification was simple yet vital. Corroborate the facts. I discreetly asked teammates about who contributed what, framing the questions as concern for accuracy. I phrased things like, "Hey, do you remember who wrote Section B of the deck? I'm double-checking authorship for the archives." Some shrugged, others volunteered little truths. "I thought that was your slide. Didn't you do the data pull?" And these casual confirmations were gold. I saved their replies. I asked IT to help recover earlier file versions on the pretense of cleaning our shared drive. When the recovered versions showed my name in the metadata, my pulse quickened, but outwardly I kept my composure. This part was boring, almost bureaucratic, but it was the mortar that would hold the case together. Exposure required timing. Revealing everything too early would raise defenses, give Mark a chance to gaslight or to reframe events. So I let the dossier quietly expand. While I accumulated proof, I seeded the environment with small traps. I CC'd myself on collaborative messages more diligently, left comments in shared documents that referenced my contributions, and made sure my drafts carried metadata that couldn't easily be altered. I set up innocuous backups that contained the layers of edits, those hidden histories that would show the arc of creation. I started phrasing status updates in a way that highlighted authorship without sounding defensive. Attached is the draft I prepared last night for review. Little nudges like that left trails. Orchestration was the dark art. I mapped corporate politics like a battlefield. Who reported to whom? Who had influence? Which managers were meticulous about documentation? And which trusted charisma over content? My target was not the whole company but the fragile center that determined promotions and bonuses. I began to shape small, seemingly harmless incidents that would nudge attention toward the truth. I scheduled a one-on-one with Mark's manager under the guise of a routine status check. I prepared an innocuous agenda: process improvements, streamlined report ownership, clarifying responsibilities. The meeting would be the stage. The dossier would be the script. I also rehearsed for resistance. I wrote down the responses Mark might give and practiced disarming them with more data. If he claimed collaboration, I had emails timestamped before his contributions. If he said he polished my work, I had version histories that showed he had not. I anticipated counter-narratives and neutralized them in advance. It felt less like plotting and more like preparing for a trial where my only witnesses were spreadsheets and timestamps. I practiced my tone until it was cool and impartial. Anger in the delivery would make it personal, and personal would be dismissed. There were personal costs. I had to become less trusting, colder in small social niceties. I turned down drinks where Mark might dominate the conversation and stopped volunteering information in open forums. At lunch I ate alone while I typed notes. The loneliness was linearly proportional to my resolve. Solitude sharpened focus. Yet there was a thrill I didn't admit to. Each verified entry was a small victory, a tiny flicker of justice. The ledger grew heavy with meaning, and in its weight I found a strange comfort. It no longer felt like revenge but like correction, a rebalancing of a ledger that had been carelessly skewed for too long. Then came the subtle cruelty of waiting. Mark continued his performance. Jokes, lateral moves, the signature smile he used to charm managers. But cracks began to appear. In one meeting, his presentation faltered when someone asked specifics about a calculation. He laughed, stammered, and pointed vaguely to the team for the details. My stomach clenched, but I kept my face impassive. I noted it in the ledger, 04/14, asked about calculation, deferred to team. The small failures accumulated. They were not dramatic, but they were real. The real turning point was a quarterly recognition board when an award for excellence was announced. Mark accepted the plaque with both confidence and flair, and the applause felt like a blow. But behind his grin I noticed quick, furtive glances, anxiety masked as humility. Sometimes the truth shows itself in the smallest gestures, a too long pause, an evasive look. I stored those gestures too, because they were part of the pattern. I watched where he kept his achievements. How many of them were recycled versions of things I had drafted weeks earlier? The juxtaposition was almost absurd, like watching a magician reveal the trick through sloppy movement. Finally, the day of action arrived, and the plan unfolded like a carefully rehearsed play. I requested a formal review meeting with the department head, ostensibly to discuss process improvements. The manager agreed. He appreciated structure. I arrived with a slim folder, neat and unassuming. Inside were copies of my documented evidence, emails, timestamps, version files, and a simple timeline of contributions. No accusations. Just a chronology. I spoke calmly, laying out the sequence of edits and the shifts in ownership. I pointed out patterns, how Mark's initiatives followed the distribution of my drafts, how praise had correlated with forwarded messages that omitted my name. I watched the manager's face change from polite curiosity to focused concern. Colleagues were drawn in. Whispers began to ripple. The manager asked a practical question, and I answered with data. It was almost too easy. I did not revel in the exposure. I remained measured. My tone was calm, almost apologetic for taking up time. But the ledger had done its work. It had turned an emotional issue into a procedural failure. And in that pivot, the company's policies, those dry protocols about authorship and credit, became as much my allies as my ammunition. With HR and IT involved, the review expanded into an investigation. Mark was asked for explanations. He smiled less now. His answers were rehearsed and hollow against the proof I had assembled. I waited for justice to settle, patient and cold. The walls of Mark's empire didn't collapse all at once. They cracked slowly, like glass under pressure, until one day the whole structure shattered. At first, he tried to laugh it off. When our department head asked him to clarify who exactly had prepared the last quarterly forecast, Mark gave one of his signature smirks and said, "Well, it was a team effort. I coordinated things, but of course, everyone pitched in." But the manager wasn't smiling. He turned the printed packet of version histories toward him, highlighting my name in the metadata. He didn't accuse, didn't raise his voice. He simply asked again, quietly, "So you wrote this?" I watched the pause. It was delicious. Mark's grin flickered, just for a second, before he composed himself and muttered something vague about refining drafts. But the damage was already done. The lie was visible, and once a liar is forced to defend himself, the charm wears off quickly. From that day forward, he was no longer untouchable. The investigation widened. HR started pulling random reports, checking metadata, interviewing colleagues. My quiet documentation, months of late nights spent building the perfect record, became their roadmap. Every trap I'd laid, every email I'd saved, every version I'd preserved, it all pointed back to the same conclusion. Mark had been a parasite on the team for a very long time. He tried to rally allies, of course. He whispered to the junior analyst he had groomed, hoping for backup, but the kid cracked almost immediately when HR showed him the file history. He tried charming the HR coordinator he used to flirt with during coffee breaks, but charm doesn't hold up well against hard evidence. And me. I just kept my head down. Calm. Professional. I didn't gloat. Didn't smirk. That was the sweetest part. I didn't need to fight anymore. The truth was doing all the heavy lifting. But I'll admit something. The anticipation was intoxicating. Every day felt like watching a slow-motion train wreck that only I knew the ending to. Mark would stroll into the office with his usual swagger, trying to act unbothered, but I could see it, the tension in his jaw, the way his smile looked more forced. He stopped making big speeches in meetings. He stopped volunteering for presentations. For the first time, Mark looked small. And then came the meeting. It was a Monday morning, the kind of gray, rainy day that already felt heavy before it even began. HR called Mark into the conference room. The blinds were shut, the atmosphere sterile. A few of us were asked to join, not as accusers, but as witnesses to clarify work processes. I sat down across the table from him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The manager slid the compiled report across the table, a timeline of stolen credit, proof stacked like bricks in a wall. Mark, the manager said flatly, do you have any explanation for this? There it was. The moment I had been waiting for. I swear, the silence in that room could have cut glass. Mark shuffled through the papers, stammering, sweating. He tried to spin it as miscommunication, as shared responsibility. He even had the audacity to say, well, isn't the important thing that the team succeeded? But the manager wasn't having it. Mark, this isn't about teamwork. This is about integrity. Boom. You could almost hear the final nail being hammered into the coffin of his career. HR asked me to clarify a few contributions. Calmly, without malice, I confirmed the details, each one lining up perfectly with the evidence. The more I spoke, the smaller Mark looked. His face flushed red, his hands clenched tight, his voice quivered. The mask was gone. The golden boy of the office, the smooth-talking charmer who had stolen my work for months, was now exposed as nothing more than a fraud. But here's the thing. I didn't want just exposure. I wanted consequence. I wanted him to feel the weight of what he'd done. And oh, did he feel it? The decision came swiftly. Mark was stripped of his upcoming bonus immediately. His Employee Excellence Award was rescinded, the plaque taken down from the recognition board in the hallway. But that wasn't enough. The manager announced that due to the severity of the findings, Mark would be demoted. From senior analyst to junior support staff. That's right, after months of strutting around like he owned the place, Mark now had to take orders from the very people he used to boss around. Including me. The look on his face when the demotion was announced? Priceless. His jaw dropped, his eyes went wide, and for the first time ever, Mark was speechless. I wish I could say I didn't enjoy it. I wish I could say I just felt justice, nothing more. But the truth. It was intoxicating. Watching the office golden boy crumble, watching his fake empire collapse in front of everyone, it was the purest satisfaction I had ever felt. Word spread quickly. The whispers in the break room, the sideways glances in the hall, the quiet smirks from coworkers who had also suffered under Mark's freeloading. He became a joke, a cautionary tale, the subject of every whispered conversation. The man who once loved attention now couldn't walk into a room without feeling the weight of humiliation. And me. For the first time I felt seen. My boss called me into his office, thanked me personally for my hard work, and promised that my contributions wouldn't go unnoticed again. For once, I wasn't invisible. For once, the spotlight was on me, and it wasn't stolen. But the best part? The revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was quiet, calculated, inevitable. Mark had built his career on lies. And all I did was shine a light. He did the rest himself. Most people thought the demotion was the end of it. Justice had been served, balance restored. Mark had lost his bonuses, his shiny award, and his title. To the average coworker, that seemed fair enough. But not to me. Because I knew Mark. I knew humiliation alone wouldn't change him. He wasn't the kind of man who reflected on his mistakes, learned from them, or rebuilt with humility. No, he was the type to stew, to plot, to find some slimy way back to the top. If left unchecked, he'd start whispering in the right ears, manipulating narratives, and eventually crawling his way back into the boss's good graces. I couldn't let that happen. So, while he licked his wounds, I was already planning phase 2. It started subtly. Mark's new role required him to handle tedious support tasks, data entry, reconciliations, file cleanup. Work that couldn't easily be passed off onto others. But I knew Mark's ego wouldn't allow him to actually do the grunt work properly. Sure enough, within a week, errors started piling up. Small things at first: misfiled documents, incomplete entries, sloppy cross-checks. I kept an eye on everything. Quietly. Methodically. I flagged mistakes, but not loudly, just enough so there was a record. I'd email the manager, copying Mark, saying things like, "Noticed an inconsistency in the data from Friday. Looks like column totals don't match. Could we double-check?" Always polite. Always professional. But every one of those little double-checks was another nail in his coffin. The thing about reputations is that once they're damaged, even small cracks look like gaping holes. The same managers who once ignored his flaws now scrutinized his every move. Every mistake looked magnified. Every slip-up became another whisper in the office grapevine. And I wasn't done. Remember that thick dossier I'd built? I didn't burn it after the investigation. I still had copies, neatly organized, ready for deployment. And I knew exactly where to use it next, outside our company walls. Mark had always been obsessed with networking. He went to industry mixers, boasted on LinkedIn about team leadership and driving results, always angling for the next big opportunity. He wanted to look like a star to other companies. So when I saw him polishing up his LinkedIn profile just weeks after his demotion, I knew what he was trying to do. Escape the mess he'd made here and sell his lies somewhere else. Not on my watch. Carefully, anonymously, I started seeding the truth. Not lies. Never lies. Just cold, undeniable truth. I created an anonymous email account and sent select snippets of the HR findings to a couple of recruiters in the industry, phrased like, "Just thought you should be aware before considering this candidate." I wasn't dramatic, just factual. I attached proof, metadata screenshots, side-by-side comparisons of his stolen work. Enough to raise eyebrows, enough to plant doubt. Then I turned to LinkedIn itself. Mark had posted some smug update about navigating new challenges in my career. So I left a subtle comment. Interesting. Is this about the performance review findings from last quarter? I didn't need to say more. Within hours, the comment was gone, deleted by him, but not before a few dozen connections had seen it. The whispers had officially spread beyond the office. And oh, how quickly it snowballed. Recruiters stopped calling him. The networking buddies he bragged about started keeping their distance. His carefully polished image as the golden professional was crumbling, not just inside the company but across the entire industry. And here's the best part. I didn't have to lift a finger after that. The truth had momentum. Once people smelled blood in the water, they did the rest themselves. Gossip traveled faster than any email I could have written. Colleagues from other firms whispered about the analyst who got demoted for plagiarism. Former co-workers he had wronged chimed in, adding their own stories. His name became radioactive. Inside our office, the fallout got worse too. Managers stopped trusting him with even the simplest tasks. He was excluded from key meetings, sidelined to grunt work, treated like a liability rather than an asset. I once walked past his desk and saw him staring at a spreadsheet, shoulders slumped, the sparkle in his eyes completely gone. The man who used to strut now looked like a ghost. And I won't lie, I savored it. Every late night I had endured, every time he had stolen my work, every smug smile he had given me during meetings, it all came rushing back, and now I was finally watching him drown in the consequences. But the final blow, that came a month later. Our department had a big presentation scheduled for an external partner. Normally, this would have been Mark's moment to shine, the kind of event he lived for. But this time, the manager handed the reins to me. I prepared everything. The data, the slides, the pitch. And when the day came, I stood at the front of the room, delivering the presentation with confidence, while Mark sat silently at the back, taking notes like an intern. When the partner praised the clarity of the report, the manager smiled and said, "That's all thanks to my name. They've been leading the way on this for months." And just like that, the recognition I had been denied for so long was mine. In front of everyone. With Mark forced to watch. That moment was better than any bonus. Better than any promotion. It was pure, unfiltered vindication. And for Mark, it was the end. Humiliated in the office. Blacklisted in the industry. Stripped of his status, his credibility, his future prospects. The golden boy had fallen, and he had fallen hard. And all it took was patience, persistence, and the truth. Revenge has a strange flavor. It's sweet at first, like sugar melting on your tongue, but then it leaves behind this deeper, more complex aftertaste. Something almost addictive. 4 weeks after Mark's collapse, I carried that sweetness with me. Every time I walked into the office and saw his slumped shoulders, every time I overheard someone whisper about what happened to him, I felt it again, that quiet satisfaction of justice finally served. But something else surprised me too. My own transformation. Before all this, I had been invisible. The quiet worker. The person who stayed late, did the heavy lifting, but never got recognition. Mark had thrived because I had stayed silent. And once I finally fought back, not with shouting, not with drama, but with precision and patience, people started to see me differently. Managers consulted me more. Co-workers came to me for guidance. Even the interns, who used to barely know my name, started asking me how I stayed so organized, how I managed to keep track of everything. I had become the reliable one, the trustworthy one, the opposite of Mark. And yet, despite the newfound respect, I never flaunted it. That was Mark's mistake. He craved the spotlight so badly that he lost everything. I learned that true power lies in not needing recognition, but in being undeniable when the moment arrives. As for Mark, his downfall wasn't just professional, it was personal too. I didn't seek out the details, but gossip has a way of finding you. One colleague whispered that his girlfriend had left him, tired of his arrogance now that the money and prestige were gone. Another mentioned that he tried applying to 3 different firms in the city, but word of his performance review issues had already spread. He didn't even make it past the first interview. One day, I passed by the break room and overheard him on the phone. His voice was low, defeated. "Yeah, I'm still looking. I'll take anything at this point." That was the moment it really hit me. The man who once strutted around in expensive suits, bragging about bonuses and awards, was now begging for scraps. It wasn't just a fall from grace. It was a free fall with no parachute. And the irony? It was all self-inflicted. I hadn't lied. I hadn't exaggerated. I hadn't twisted anything. I had simply shown the truth he had tried to bury under layers of charm and manipulation. He built his empire on stolen credit, and when the truth came out, it all crumbled like sand. But here's the kicker. I never got in trouble for it. Because what could they accuse me of? Being too thorough. Keeping good records. Making sure credit was properly assigned? If anything, my meticulousness was praised. Still, I didn't walk away untouched. Revenge changes you. It hardens you. Makes you sharper. Colder. For a while, I couldn't look at any colleague without wondering, are they another Mark? Are they waiting to steal my work too? But over time, I learned balance. I realized that not everyone was like him. Most people just wanted to do their jobs, go home, and live their lives. Mark was an outlier, a parasite who thrived on others' effort. And once he was gone, the office felt lighter. No more fake smiles in meetings. No more stolen credit. No more whispered frustrations from coworkers who were too scared to speak up. It was as if the entire team could finally breathe again. Months passed. My reputation grew. Eventually, I got the promotion Mark had always wanted. Not because I played politics, not because I bragged, but because when the time came, there was no denying the impact I had made. And Mark, he disappeared. One day, his desk was empty. No goodbye email. No farewell party. Just gone. HR said he had resigned to pursue other opportunities, but everyone knew the truth. He had been pushed out, cornered by his own incompetence, blacklisted by his own arrogance. The last I heard, he was working at a small startup far outside the city, doing grunt work for a fraction of what he used to make. Some said he was miserable. Others said he had grown bitter, blaming everyone but himself. As for me, I didn't feel sorry for him. Not even a little. Because here's the thing about revenge. It doesn't just punish the guilty. It restores the balance. It shows people that you're not someone to be stepped on. It reminds the world that justice may be slow, but it always comes. Sometimes quietly, sometimes explosively, but it comes. And in my case, it came with the sweetest satisfaction I've ever known. I had been invisible once. But thanks to Mark, and his arrogance, his greed, his laziness, I had become undeniable. And that, in the end, was the greatest revenge of all.